Our next presenter, who is presenting on overcoming barriers in minority adoption and disproportionality, is Dr. Ruth McRoy. And again, she said, I don't have to read her entire bio, which is very extensive and illustrious as well. But she's a research professor and the Ruby Lee Peister Centennial Professor Emerita at the University of Texas at Austin School of Social Work, and since 2005, she has been a visiting research professor at the Boston College Graduate School of Social Work. She currently lives in California, correct? Right? And another presentation that I think that we will find extremely informative and very much in touch with the work that you are doing.
Thank you very much. All right, thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here. I've kept thinking this morning, listening to Carol, that with all the focus on change, of course, the one person we think about a lot is our President-elect, Obama, and we think about change. All right. And as we think about that change you can believe in, and I kept thinking about what is it? Yeah, what is it that we can do to really be successful as leaders now that there is an opportunity for the first time with somebody in the White House who really can produce change. And one of the things that Carol talked about was putting together both your opponents and those that are supporters. And that's exactly what he's done with his team. He's brought in those who were opponents and is going to benefit from their knowledge. And it's the same kind of principle that Carol talked about that is very effective in this field as well. We're going to talk about one of the issues that is on the forefront of discussions these days in child welfare, and that is the issue of disproportionality. And I just want to mention, and many of you probably have received your latest issue of child welfare, but this whole volume is on disproportionality. Very well done. And the special issue, racial disproportionality in child welfare, in fact, they got so many papers that they made it a double issue. So if you don't have it, be sure that you get it. Wonderful resource, and it just came out, although it's listed as the, I think, March-April issue, it did just come out last week, and it's well done. I don't know if Ada wants to say anything about it, because she was a part of that process when it was formulated. Right, it's out. It's out. It's very well done, but something that you may want to take a look at as well. I want to talk about some of the data related to disproportionality. Again, building on this concept of leadership, one of the first things that you have to be a good leader is to have knowledge, of the data. And when you go to present your case, it's important that you have the facts and figures correct. You know what the information is out there, and there's a lot of information on this topic. And so we're going to talk a bit about what do we know about it, what are the sources of information, and then specifically, how does this affect adoptions? Because so often when we talk about disproportionality, we're talking about it as a front-end issue, but it is also a back-end issue. In Texas, for the last 2 years, we've had a conference just called Adoption Disproportionality for the purpose of zeroing in on that concept, from looking at what happens when kids are going through the system and why do we still have disproportionate outcomes. One of the first things to think about in relation to the concept is, what does it mean? You read about disproportionality, you read about overrepresentation and underrepresentation, you read about disparate outcomes. And number one, it's important to think about what are the definitions. Disproportionality is referring to the over or underrepresentation of minority children under age 18 in foster care compared to their representation to the general population. And if you look at the percentages, as we will in a minute, we have both over and underrepresentation of certain groups. We talk a lot about overrepresentation. There's also an issue of underrepresentation. It's also, we can talk about the differences in numbers, but it's also important to look at the concept of disparities. Often we have disparate treatment. What happens in the process, inequitable treatment under services provided to minority children as compared to those similarly situated Caucasian children. That's the comparison that's most often made. For example, if you look at the most recent data in terms of the number of children in care compared to their percentages in the U.S. child population, you will see the situation that's described as disproportionate representation. For example, of the 510,000 children in care in 2006, latest data that we've got, 40% of those kids in care are white, 19% Hispanic Latino, 32% African American, 1% Asian American, 2% American Indian, Alaskan Native. Now, if you compare those to their percentages in the population, this is national data, the percentages in the population, 61% of the U.S. child population under 18 is white, yet 40% in care, 17% U.S. child population Hispanic, 19% in care. If you've looked at the numbers, the trend data over time, the percentages of Hispanic children has been increasing. And again, let me emphasize, these are national data. It varies in your state, in your region, in your county, in your city. And you want to look at the data in your locale because there's certain areas, for example, my home states, I add now both states, Texas and California, we have higher representation of Latino, Hispanic children. So you have to look at the different data within the state. 15% African American children, U.S. child population, yet 32% in care. That is twice the percentage, more than twice the percentage. So you understand the issue here. With Asian American children, we've got just 1% in care. Some look at that and say that is underrepresentation because the reality is sometimes bias sometimes leads us to be less likely to bring certain groups of children, particularly those groups that some consider to be stereotypically the model minority. And in one of the many conferences that have been held on this topic, there was a discussion about that with representatives from Asian communities saying maybe to some extent nobody's looking at our communities as well. These are issues to put on the table. American Indian population, again, we've got twice the percentage. American Indian and African American, the greatest disproportionality, national data. The question is this ethical? Is this right? And think about it, as I go through this, think about your state, your locale, what does it look like? In almost every state, children of color are disproportionately represented in the child welfare system. African Americans overrepresented in 46 states. Native American children overrepresented in 24, Latinos overrepresented in 6 states. What is happening? And you start in this process of sort of drilling down to figure out what is this, what's happening with this overrepresentation. You also want to look at your data in your state by trends. Have things changed over time? This suggests that back in 1982, when we had 262,000 children in care, about 52% were Anglo. There were more Anglo than children of color. Look at the changes in not only the overall numbers of children in care over the years, but changes in representation by population group. And as I mentioned before, in 2006, we've got 510,000 in care, 40% Anglo. You see a gradual we saw a drop in Anglo children in care between 82 and 93. We've seen some gradual drops and then beginning slight increase and then drop of 1% between 2005 and 2006. But you're looking at the total number of children in care and then looking at it in terms of percentages of each group and how this looks. And again, these are the data that you want to know in your state, in your region. How can you discuss? You want to come to the table prepared to discuss what your data look like. What's the average age of the children? What's the percentage of males and females? What's the average period of time they're in care? And then you want to break that down by ethnic group. And within your state, you should have the resources available to do those calculations. Ask your data people, present me with this information, break it down by state, by group, by average period of time kids are in care, and also, what is the goal? And are there differences in goals by racial group? Now, what I'm presenting here is national data. If I look at AFGARs, the material that's available on the Children's Bureau, it's not by racial group, is not being broken down at that point. You need to do that in your locale. Break it down. How many have a goal of reunification? How many have a goal of adoption or long-term foster care? And break it down by racial or ethnic group to get a better feel of what the situation is in your locale. A lot of times people are suggesting that one of the reasons we have overrepresentation has to do with the issue of poverty. In fact, Leroy Pelton wrote a book called For Reasons of Poverty, which suggested that families living in poverty are those that are most susceptible. As they say, families living in poverty are most likely to be living in resource-poor communities, geographically isolated from other communities that might offer support and services. Without access to services, families are further compromised. The more compromised these families are, the more likely it is that they'll eventually come into contact with the system. Part of your, yes? Leroy Pelton wrote the book For Reasons of Poverty. And one of the things to look at in your area is what resources are available in the communities from which your families come. What are the resources available? What are the supports available in those locales? To what extent might that make a difference? A lot of systems are doing decision point analyses to better understand this concept. And again, I suggest in your role as becoming or maintaining your roles as leaders, you want to have access to this kind of data in your state. You want to look at it in terms of what happens on the front end. Because the first question in looking at disproportionality is, number one, is there a report or not a report made? And drilling down on that, you want to know who's making the reports. Are they coming from certain schools? Are they coming from certain hospitals? From where are they coming? You want to drill down and understand the source of this. Then you want to look at it in terms of the decision to investigate or not investigate. We know that whenever there has been an incident, as one described before in the state of Connecticut, there's been an incident, all states have experienced this. If there's been a child death, for example, it's been in the paper, what happens? Investigations go up, go sky high for the next few months. Then they start dropping a little bit. So you want to analyze what all is going on. What factors lead to the decision to investigate or not investigate? The next step is substantiation. What cases are substantiated and what cases are not? Then looking at what happens to the cases. Which cases get closed? Which cases get in-home services? The children remain in home. Or which cases are involving the children being removed from their home? And then, where are they going? And you're going to break that down by race too. How many are going to relatives and how many are going to non-related foster care providers? And then what's the next step? You're going to break it down by who gets reunified. You're going to look at it in terms of how many of these kids are remaining in care or how many are aging out. How many get adopted? And you want to look at each of these decision points by race. Then you're getting a picture of what your child welfare system is looking like. Just to give an example, you can graphically show what happens at each decision point. The state of California has done a really good job in making all of this data transparent. It's on the website. You can just look at it. You can pull up. You can easily see county by county. And Heidi can tell you all about that. It's available just for anybody to look at, to see what's happening in each county and at each decision point. When we look again, yes.
I have a question about the report versus no report. At what point is a California or a Texas able to identify the that the reporting party is able to say that the person that they are believing they're suspecting of alleged abuse and neglect is African American, is Latino, is Anglo, that the perpetrator is of a certain group. Mm-hmm. How accurate is that reporting information, and does it get corrected at the point of actual investigation or case open?
That's a good question, and I don't know to what extent that level of investigation has happened to really understand who was the reporter, what is the race of the person that is being reported. I can tell you that there have been some very some pretty detailed investigations that have been done when a state has been sued. And let me give you the example of the state of Tennessee. When Tennessee was sued through the Brian A. lawsuit back in 2001, Children's Rights sued Tennessee because of one of the factors they were sued had to do with disproportionate representation. At that time when they were sued, 4,500 of the 9,000 children in care were African American. That led to one of the reasons for Children's Rights to sue the state. In the process of understanding what happened, we were involved in that investigation, and what we did was went to different sources like hospitals and interviewed nurses. We interviewed physicians, and we wanted to find out to what extent the race of the child, the race of the birth mother in many cases, those different factors might have influenced. And we got some pretty hard evidence that bias makes a difference, and the greater likelihood, for example, in many cases of nurses to report a child perhaps prenatally exposed to substances with an African American mother versus a white mother. Those are the kinds of things you want to start looking at and then begin to see. And you know, a lot of the states who have gotten involved in doing the training on doing racism, Texas, California, a few others have done this. They've begun to look at, from the worker level, looking primarily at decision making and to what extent bias impacts decisions. But we need to have that same kind of training that's impacting the school system, the mental health system, the judicial system, all of those, to what extent. But the other thing that's important to note here is the research that has been done looking at race of reporter and race of investigator has shown that in some cases it is not just a slam dunk that it's going to be somebody of a different group. In some cases, there are persons who are African American doing the investigation who may be very likely to call for child removal, maybe so in some cases even more so than if the person were of a different background. There are a lot of factors involved here. A lot of things have to do with this process. Sometimes it's the supervision. Sometimes it's, you know, there are a lot of factors. We could list a dozen of them that are impacting it. But you want to get a picture of what's going on in your locale. Where are the referrals coming from? Who's making the referrals? Who's doing the investigation? What is the outcome? And take a subsample of those cases to see, should some different decisions have been made? And to what extent has family group decision making, team conferencing, and so forth gone on to keep these kids out of the system? There's a program in Compton, California that's discussed in here as well called Point of Engagement that talks about children no longer coming into the system because families are brought together immediately. Before it used to be, there's an example here of a worker going, and before the worker goes and puts a baby seat in the car to go pick up a child. That's not happening now because family members are brought together right at the hospital, and let's get this child not to a foster home but to a relative immediately. And they found reductions in children coming into care. And then that's not the end of it, but additional services are being provided to the family. Let's say it's parental substance abuse, then those family members are getting the services they need to enable them to parent their children. So it's a matter of comprehensive services to make a difference. It's a matter of change in how we think about service delivery, and we won't have these outcomes because right now with African American children nationally, 23% of victims are African American, 26% of those entering care, 32% of those in care, and 36% of those waiting to be adopted. And you see at each decision point we see some increases. And these are the decision points that you want to look at and understand and drill down to see who's doing the reporting, what's happening, what are some of the factors, what kind of training do we need, how can we keep this from happening in your locale. You know, and as you think about it in terms of what data are you familiar with in your area, in your region, in your state. What has been said? Have there been some major initiatives looking at disproportionality? In the state of Texas, the legislature passed several years ago now, passed a law that required disproportionality specialists to be hired in each region of our state. We have a disproportionality specialist, and that's to a large extent thanks to Joyce James, Associate Commissioner in the state of Texas. It's happening in every state. There are disproportionality conferences that are held. As I mentioned before, the Adoption Disproportionality Conference that has gone on now for 2 years. What's happening in the state? what's being done in the legislature to address some of these issues. And are the strategies working? And the only way you know if they're working is to look at the numbers. Do we see some declines? Do we see some greater services? What's happening? But the issue when we start thinking about disproportionality is, number one, is this something that just happened? Many of you are, probably nobody here as old as I am, but when I was in school back in the 60s, and there was a study that was done by Helen Jeter in 1963. And at that time, she reported that black children back then, I could go back before then, but I'm just starting at 63, a little over 40 years ago, were remaining in foster care for longer periods of time than white children. Adoption was not being offered on an equitable basis. Ongoing discrimination in service provision. Black children were being served primarily at that time by public agencies and white children being served by private agencies in the 60s. You can think about the time period, all that was happening during that period of time. But how different do we see things today? Billingsley and Giovanni back in 1972 wrote the book you probably read. I used to assign it in my class as Children of the Storm, which was a history of black children in the child welfare system. And they identified back in 1972 that the system of child welfare is failing black children. It's our thesis that the failure is a manifest result of racism, that racism has pervaded the development of the system of services and it persists in its present operation. And the question is, does it still exist? What are the factors that are happening? And is it a combination of many factors that lead to the outcomes we have today? When we think about it in terms of disparities, meaning again the inequitable treatment or service outcomes, why is this happening? Why are we still talking about it today? And how can we get it on the forefront of the agenda now in Washington to try to change outcomes for children? When we look at it in terms of, again, what speculation has been given as to why we see these outcomes. Some have said, well, African American families are more likely to abuse and neglect their children. Yet the national incidence studies, the NIST studies 1, 2, and 3 have all found they've looked specifically at incidents of child abuse and neglect, and they reported no differences in incidents of child abuse and neglect by racial group. That was one of the first hypotheses. Well, there's a big difference. They found no difference. When we look at Fred Wolchen's work published in 2007 with the Multi-Foster Care Data Archive, he found that you're looking at entry rates, and he found that disparities in entry rates decreased from 2000 to 2005 because the placement rate for white children increased while the rate for black children tended to decline. He began to look at it more specifically, well, what's happening by age of child, and found that placement and disparity rates are higher for infants. The risk of placement for African American infants was nearly 3 times that of white infants. Again, a piece of information you want to look at. You can't look at it in general and just, you have to break it down. Well, what are the ages of these kids? Are we finding placement rates higher for certain ages of children by racial background? And this suggested the need for prenatal care and substance abuse treatment. And that's another piece you look at, since so many children are coming to care because of substance abuse, parental substance abuse. What kind of services are available in your community? Is there a waiting list? What do those services involve? Are there programs that allow mothers and children to remain together rather than be separated? Because those are the programs that tend to be most successful when the children are together. What kind of explanations have been given for the outcome of disproportionality? Over the years, a number of reasons have been given, including labeling bias, differential attributions, disproportionate poverty. Duncan Lindsay, Leroy Pelton, I mentioned before, found that parental income is the best predictor of child removal and placement. The majority of children that come into care are from single-parent, low-income households. Given that, what does that mean in terms of changing our pattern of service delivery? What does that mean in terms of needs of families? We look at it in terms of the poverty rate. And again, yes, we have higher poverty rates among African Americans and American Indians. 24.9% African American Indians, 25.3, compared to 8.3 white poverty rates. This is an issue that needs to be addressed when we look at the overall poverty rates. When we look at neglect, which is the primary reason children come into care, it's often a product of poverty. Parents are under scrutiny. They're more likely to be reported. Some of you may have been interviewed by the Government Accountability Office last year. Anybody remember that? The GAO office came, okay, raise your hands. Yeah, they came around and they went to various states and they wanted to explore the issue of disproportionality to try to figure out what is the cause of this. And they issued a report that many of you probably have read that identifies the following causes of disproportionality among African Americans, including higher rate of poverty, challenges in accessing support services. And they found in their study that the top 3 sources of referrals to CPS are from educational staff, schools, law enforcement officials, and social services personnel. Now that, again, that's based on their national review of where are these reports coming from. They also found that once African American children are removed from their homes, the lengths of stay in foster care average 9 months longer than those of white children. They found some other related factors, including limited access to family support services in terms of parenting skills, counseling services, limited or inadequate legal representation of birth parents. For example, if anybody in this room might have an allegation made against them, what would you do? Get a private attorney. One of the issues is the issue related to representation and being able to fight to get a child back. And there are a lot of economic issues here. States have difficulties in finding appropriate permanent homes as being another factor that they identified that leads these kids to stay in care longer. The GAO also found that there were challenges in accessing those services I mentioned before in terms of substance abuse, subsidized housing. All of that, if families cannot come up to par in terms of their need for and completion of substance abuse and need for appropriate housing, then the child's not being returned. That's an issue that we need to address in terms of our communities, in terms of our cities, to find out what can be done. And again, now we have to look at it in terms of the recession that we're into. And what are cities going to do? Are we predicting worse outcomes? What's going to happen? Because these figures were when things were fairly good. Lack of substance abuse treatment services impacted families' ability to move towards reunification. If services are available, it may take 2 years for a parent to complete a substance abuse program. These are all issues. The other thing that we're finding in terms of some of the differences in numbers of white children, for example, coming into care has a lot to do with growing what use? Methamphetamine, growing meth use. And as a result, we're going to continue to see some changes in the statistics in terms of who's coming in to care. GAO also found that racial bias or cultural misunderstanding and distrust between workers and juvenile and family court judges contribute to child removals. We used to speculate that, but now that we've got a GAO-funded report that came out and documented it, we can say that this is one of the issues that was evident in many places throughout the country. They found also that cultural misunderstandings come about as a result of class differences between caseworkers and families, being able to make those judgments, what we're looking for. As was quoted in the report, even well-meaning decision makers may have faulty assumptions about racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. And where do we get the training on this? Even though we're required in our schools of social work to take a course, often what I call the group of the week, looking at cultural diversity, does that really teach you and prepare you to work with families? You may know something about the history of a particular group, but does that prepare you when you go one-to-one with a family? To what extent is training that's been given in your state focused upon service delivery two particular populations. Of course, I used to teach at the University of Texas with social work practice with African American families. I taught it each semester for 25 years, and I learned something each semester. There's always something that you can learn about, and that was one group that I came from. So we can't even assume that just because you come from that group, you know about that group. There's a lot to be learned. When we think about it in terms of the GAO report findings also, they found that parental distrust of the child welfare system was also a factor. This is something Carol mentioned earlier in terms of the perception of families, of staff, distrust, because the child welfare system is often viewed as that system that takes away children. We can't trust them, and that can contribute to longer lengths of stay. They also found that distrust due to persons in the community often having prior adversarial relationships with various systems, including the school system, public health system, and criminal justice system, and all of those being factors that led to disproportionate outcomes. Yes?
Parents distrust, is it just that they don't approach the system?
Okay. The distrust of the system, like the educational system and the child welfare system?
Yes.
A lot of that, of course, let's think about it just for a minute. How many of you work with families that don't trust you? That don't trust what? Because what's the fear? What's it about? The child will be removed. And you know other people whose children have been removed. There are some communities you go to in which large numbers of children have been removed at one time or another. So there's fear. There's distrust. There's distrust of other systems too, the judicial system, because there are disproportionate numbers of, for example, African American men in particular that are in the criminal justice system. That's a whole nother piece on criminal justice disproportionality and all of the issues associated with that. We also know, and there are plenty of reports that suggest the issues in terms of the mental health system. We also know in terms of the school system, and many of these families may not have been one successful themselves in the educational system, and therefore have some distrust about dealing with teachers and principals and folks within that system. So a lot of these previous experiences, that is direct experience or indirect that you've heard about through somebody who's your neighbor, has influenced your feeling about this particular system. And even though you may be the best worker in the world, you work for a system that may not be viewed as positively. When we think about the experiences in the child welfare system, a report from the Children's Defense Fund, the Cradle to Prison Pipeline, that was published in 2007, they reported, Marion Wright Edelman's group here in Washington reported that African American foster children are more likely to be retained in school, have lower standardized test scores, more likely to be absent, tardy, or truant, and have higher dropout rates, and are less likely to receive mental health services than other children in foster care. So we're talking about an intersystemic kind of problem that's impacting a lot of different areas, because when we think about children in care, if they're remaining in care for longer periods of time, what happens to them? They get moved. And almost every time there's a move, they move to another school. And I don't know about you, but if with you and your children that you may have raised, but a lot of times you have to start all over again with records and to provide to the next teacher and to the next. And sometimes those records don't come around real fast. And sometimes a year might pass, but who's going to be advocating for this child in the school? There are a lot of issues here. They are more likely to be dropping out. Look at the number of children. There are, 26,000 children age out of foster care each year, and they become a large percentage of the, homeless population. And many times, even though we may have laws that provide assistance in terms of putting these kids in college, many of them are never going to college because they have not finished high school. So there's some serious issues in terms of their educational experiences that have to be addressed as well. We know that there are disparities in these other systems. For example, in the educational system, there are disproportionately high numbers of African American children that are in special ed. In health care, the Surgeon General's report looked a lot at this issue that was reported when Satcher was Surgeon General. Disparities in health care provision, mental health, recent report on disparities in mental health. And of course we know about the disproportionately high number of African American children in the juvenile system and in the adult correction system. whole body of knowledge on that. Yes.
Actually, that was my question. I was going to ask you if you could comment on the correlation between the numbers of people of color landing in the prison system to those who have experienced foster care.
Right. It's kind of interesting. There was a lot of the kids that have ended up there are those kids who have been moved from place to place to place. They come out, and what are they prepared to do? Go back to an institution. And what institution is that? And a lot of these kids that, you know, a lot of kids who've been in foster care end up going into group homes. Then they go into another level of care, more residential, and a lot of those kids end up going on to other systems throughout their lives. There was a study I read not too long ago of persons who were on death row, and they did a report looking at their background. And we had two disproportionately high numbers of those persons who had had some time in care, who ended up going through the system, through the next system, through the next system, through the next. And that's a whole nother issue because, see, for example, in this room, we're talking with child welfare folks. We need to have in this room mental health. We need to have substance abuse. We need to have all the other systems because those folks have to be at the table to truly make a difference. And you talk about leadership is going to require that kind of leadership that puts all those folks around the table to say, we have a problem in our community. We want the superintendent of schools at the table. We want the director of mental health services at the table and the director of the juvenile system at the table. All of those need to be around with the director of child welfare to talk about what we're going to do about this. Let's look at the relationship from system to system and how these kids go through. One of the big issues is tracking children. And if we ever use the same number to track kids all the way, we could answer the question you had there. If we could track the same number, use the Social Security number, it's possible, and track them all the way through. And then let's look at them who end up on the back end in criminal justice, and let's see what percentage there are so that we can make that report, make the headline news, and see what's going to make a difference. We know that there are a lot of workforce issues in this process too, including staff issues. We've talked about some of these today. High caseloads, worker turnover, major issue. Training today, most of the data suggests that fewer than 15% have a bachelor's in social work or master's in social work, yet that's the area in which we're doing a lot of training to prepare staff to work in these areas. A lot of times these days, the person who was because of turnover, we've got supervisors who were workers yesterday, but a year later they become supervisors because of the turnover we've talked about before. We need more management training. Inadequate pay continues to be an issue. Pressures of the job, some of the things that you talked about earlier today. The fact that we need to staff, if you have a good understanding and information about practice outcomes, that can make a difference. A lot of times we have data people over in this area, but they're not talking to the people on the front end. There's no communication going on, so you don't know what's happened. You bring a child in, you may never know whatever happened to that child over time because your role is investigator, and you may not know that this child stayed in the system for the next 10 years. I was presenting a few weeks ago, and I was talking about a case, and somebody in the audience said, you know what? I was a worker on that case, and this is the first time this has been 15 years, and this is the first time I knew, because she said, just from the description, I know what case you're talking about, and that was my case. But nobody ever told me about that adverse outcome that occurred. Sometimes I bring in pictures, and you'll see later pictures of kids that are from the website. A lot of times I so focus on kids that are available, and I'll have people in the room say, I know that kid. I didn't know he was still on Adopt Us Kids. Those are some of the issues. We need to have training and work with diverse families. Think about the training that you may have received. To what extent have you been prepared to work with American Indian families, Latino families, African American families? And again, not just the history of the group, but day-to-day interaction. That's important. We know, again, the issue is whether or not disproportionality, the idea of eliminating disproportionality, is it a priority? Because we've been talking about it for years. So I'd say it's not a priority. What's going to be done? We know that, for example, again, There's a tracking accountability problem. Again, this is from the HHS report GAO. 18 states reported that they were not regularly using data in their efforts to address disproportionality. Not using data, 18 states. HHS does not require states to collect or report information on disproportionality. This is all from the GAO report. Lack of legislative initiatives. Only 6 states have enacted state legislation to address disproportionality. 6 out of 50. Insufficient resources. 42 states report that additional resources were needed to address disproportionality. Work has been primarily funded privately, and a lot of that's been done by Casey Family Programs. They've made that as their chief priority. It's in their 2020 plan, their strategic plan. They're going into states, they're funding programs. That's one of the reasons Undoing Racism has been offered in the state of Texas. Casey came in, funded it. Casey's funding a similar program in California now. And I really think about this when I hear on the news every day about this bailout we're about to give to the automakers. And as Marian Wright Edelman said in the publication, The Cradle to Prison Pipeline, if you haven't read it, be sure you get it off the computer. As she said, child poverty is costly. It could be eliminated for $55 billion a year and could be paid for by the tax cuts currently received by the top 1% of taxpayers. The $100 billion a year we're spending on the Iraq war could lift every child in America from poverty twice over. And when I first read that, when it came out in 2007, I was amazed at the numbers, but now billions don't mean anything anymore, do they? Because we're talking about trillions. I saw $1 trillion written down for the first time on the cover of a paper in Atlanta the other day. I said, oh my God, that's what $1 trillion looks like. All those zeros, we didn't even talk about that. Trillions we're talking about. We're talking about the national debt. When we think about how we're going through and bailing out companies now, when are we bailing out families? Do we have the resources to bail out some families? I think so. Just give us some of the money that's about to go to General Motors. We'll bail out a whole bunch of families. We need to think about priorities, and this is the time to put it on the minds of the administration. We need policy changes, and we're moving in the direction in terms of subsidized guardianships with the new law. I'll talk about that in a minute. Federal funding tends to favor foster care placements over prevention and family preservation. In 1993, the Family Preservation and Support Act was passed, and it funded family preservation services for a period of time. I think it was like 5 years. Where's all of our funding for family preservation, preserving families? We put more money into children leaving the system, coming into the system, foster care. Half the states are not meeting HHS performance goals to recruit a racially and ethnically diverse pool of potential foster and adoptive parents. Another issue. And we were talking before, looking at the CFSR reviews. What do the data say? What's being done? What if it's not happening? There are other initiatives in terms of addressing disproportionality. There's a lot of information on that. Just go to the National Adoption Information Clearinghouse, lots and lots of information. Casey Families Programs, their website, the Race Matters Consortium. In fact, there's a Race Matters conference call going on probably right now looking at the link between the judicial system and child welfare. The Casey Alliance, state initiatives. The state of Washington now has legislation focused in this area. Minnesota's been working on it, Michigan, California, to name a few. And of course, court cases like the one I mentioned before, the Brian A. court case, the Brian A. settlement from 2001. But we're going to talk now a little bit about what does this mean in terms of adoption disproportionality. Before I move to that, are there any specific questions? Because I've just been giving you background in which I want you to think about some of the issues related to now back end. Yes?
Just interested, why do you think there's been this lack of interest, lack of priority setting around this issue? Just as I was speaking at the table here, I did some work in looking at special education, disproportionality, and there was this paper out probably back in the late 90s about the fact that why are we even worried about disproportionality in special education, because at least the kids are getting the services. And there was this big outcry, I was one of those, that really said, how dare could you say something like this and looking at it like that. But there's a lot of people that really look at it and say, why are you complaining about this, or why are you concerned about it? And I'm wondering if you're seeing some of that same kind of perspective around disproportionality in adoption.
Yeah, there are a lot of folks who assume that, well, that's just sort of the way it is. It's like the special ed piece, well, at least they're getting some services. But should they be there? Giving the illustration of special ed, is it true that disproportionately high numbers of minority children need special ed? Or are they being referred there unnecessarily? And what's happening on the front end? What are some of the issues in terms of the initial training of children? I'm just going to go with the example you gave of special ed when kids come into kindergarten and first grade. What kind of opportunities are they getting? Are there differences in the schools that they attend? Are there differences in the teachers? There's so many different factors that can impact the likelihood of a child being sent. And there's some data that suggests that some kids are being sent there because they're disruptive in the classroom, various reasons. Let's get him out. Okay, let's label him ADHD. Okay, let's put him in for special kinds of services. There are a lot of issues. And we know that a lot of the children that are in our system have been labeled as well. We got to look at that in terms of whether or not are they getting the kind of service that they truly need. And we think about it in terms of child welfare and all these other areas in which there's disproportionality. The question is, why? Why is this the case? Why is it continuing? Why have we not solved the problem? And the question is, can it be solved? And let me ask you, is this a problem in your jurisdictions? Is there anybody who doesn't have this problem? Is it something that's on the table in your offices that you're talking about on a regular basis? Do you think that the right people are at the table to talk about this issue? To what extent are the legislators in your communities involved in talking about this? Or are they recognizing this being a problem? And what can be done about it? And again, I can't say enough about the opportunity that we have to begin to highlight it even more so. Yeah, Heidi.
Some of what you were talking about was how people view child welfare services. And I think, if you think about families think about if they're in trouble, where can they go and get help? And I think a lot of families think about churches. Like that's a place they would turn to. But I think very few families think about, I think I'll call the child welfare system for help.
Right.
I mean, it's like a joke.
Right.
Really, it's like a joke.
I have that number on my Rolodex here. I'll call child welfare. Yeah.
And so I think that would be something to look at if you were going to think about how could I make things better, or what could I do to change. That would certainly be one area. And I also think that another thing we do in child welfare is we tend to think of the solutions only from child welfare. But for example, I used to live in San Diego, and they got a grant so that every child in San Diego could go to after school for free if they were in elementary school or in junior high. Now, if you don't think that has an impact on child abuse rates, I mean, that was a tremendous assistance to families, and regardless of income.
Right.
It was because they got a grant to do that. It was a crime prevention grant or whatever.
That's great.
So sometimes I think solutions are not, they're also community based, and it's like, how can we change the way we think about things? And it's thinking broader. As you said, we have to get the other parties to the table and think about how to do those kind of things. So thank you for the thought-provoking discussion, because there are solutions, I think, if we think broader.
And that's a great example when you think about what are the reasons children are coming into care. Well, neglect is the primary reason. So when we start thinking about neglect, okay, maybe it's a case in which children don't have after-school care. They're being neglected. Somebody's reported these children are remaining home and there's no parent with them. We're going to report this. Well, what's being done? Recognizing the problem. The problem is the family can't afford to have pay for an after-school program. Well, let's, as a community, develop a plan. Let's apply for some federal money, and let's make it available to all children. And I bet you found, as you're suggesting, a decline in some of, if we identify, but really see what is the major reason here, what's really happening. And let me just mention something about that. So often our data just look at the concept neglect. Neglect is a broad concept. Neglect due to what? What is the reason? Is it because of parental substance abuse? If that's it, then let's solve this problem by trying to intervene with the parents. Is it neglect because the family has housing that is substandard? Then what can we do to try to link this family with a better home situation. You know, but we just label neglect. We got to drill down more and look at the record. Well, what's really the problem here? And is it something that maybe by linking with a church, they can help to connect? There's so many ways that we can resolve the problem other than child removal. Yeah.
Earlier you were talking about education and foster kids. When I worked as a case manager, it was so easy for a teacher to call and say, I'm having a problem with this kid, and it's because they knew it was a foster child. You would have the same child in the class bouncing from seat to seat, but it was okay. But you get a teacher called these kids, and the first thing they call, can you get them medicine for ADHD? You know, every foster child is hyper. Every foster child has to have medication.
That's right.
So, you know, we have to change the thinking of the education system.
That's such a good point. And, you know, again, we have trainings, we talk with ourselves about it, but we need to be in the school systems to try to help them understand, because they're not being trained in foster care. Those teachers are trying to struggle to make it through day to day to be sure the kids pass the test. That's the reality these days. And they need to be sure that these kids can sit still, so they're thinking, let's get some medication. They can sit still to pass the test, because these teachers often lose their jobs if the kids don't pass the test. And so it's a whole different mentality. We need to think about the pressures on these different parties and what can be done to address this issue. Let's just, rather than just subdue through a drug process. When we start thinking about it in terms of adoption, we think about some of the issues and look at it from a policy perspective. What are some of the policies that impact adoption, and what our figures are and what they look like today? And I'm going to talk briefly about several of these policies, just real briefly. The one that, you know, we talk about probably the most of all, Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, Interethnic Provisions, the ASFA 1997. Look at the policies, and these are the federal policies, and think about them in terms of how have they impacted service delivery in your state. And the most recent act that was passed, that was just signed into law in October, Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act. What is the impact? A lot of people are still wondering, well, how is that going to impact us? And I'm sure the Children's Bureau will be giving lots of trainings on the impact. But just real quickly, just to highlight, that's on Heidi and Matt's list of things to do. Real quickly, we know that some of the policies that have impacted where we are today include, for example, ASFA of 1997, which required there be a permanency plan for a child. When the permanency plan is adoption, you have to document the steps the agency is taking to find an adoptive family. At a minimum, such documentation should include child-specific recruitment efforts, such as the use of state, regional, national adoption exchanges, including electronic exchange systems. Now that was, what did I say, 1997. 11 years ago. Yet we are still trying to get children and families listed on the National Web Photo Listing, Adopt Us Kids. We've got about 4,000 families and about 4,000 children on there now. It's a whole lot more than that need adoption. What was that number? 129,000. We got a problem. This was the law, 1997. Just quickly talking about the most recent policy, the one that was just passed in October, Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act of 2008, it reauthorizes the Adoption Incentives Program. And I just want to say one thing about the incentives program, because that is kind of interesting. When that was passed, some state numbers began to increase. But as we were talking earlier, it sort of just leveled off. We're at that 50,000 plateau and can't seem to get above it. And so the hope is that maybe with this reauthorization and, you know, increasing the financial awards, maybe that's going to make a difference. But something has to be done. The new law is ensuring adoption assistance for children with special needs without regard to birth family income, and that's a real good policy that has changed things, going to make a big difference. It's requiring states to inform prospective adoptive parents about the adoption tax credit. I found that interesting because you'd have to have a law to require to inform families about this. It also ensures that states make reasonable efforts to keep siblings together. It's amazing that nothing's, you know, this has not been a requirement before. Siblings should be kept together. But it's saying you have to make some reasonable efforts to make this happen. Establishes subsidized guardianship payments for relatives who adopt. That's great. to be able to have that in place as well. States will be allowed to receive federal reimbursement to support foster youth up to 21. Federal support to train child welfare workers, another big issue. Native American children, now they're going to have access to federal assistance and protections, and require state agencies to exercise due diligence to identify and provide notice to all adult relatives of a child within 30 days after the child is removed from the custody of the parents. Hallelujah. 30 days. Requires state agencies to exercise due diligence to identify and provide notice. Now, hopefully that's going to address this issue of relatives not even knowing a child has come into care. They're going to have to start asking the questions about, well, who are this child's relatives? And not just the mother's side, but the father's side of the family too. To truly understand who are these relatives and to require them to notify relatives. So maybe it's going to increase the likelihood of kinship placements. Yes.
Well, we were talking earlier about that paradigm shift for cultures. This means caseworkers, case managers are going to have to ask those critical questions. And I can tell you that as I have talked about, because our State Department will be responsible for the rules relative to this recent legislation, we've been getting some feedback from our counties about what is due diligence and how far do we have to search. You know, that might mean some more effort on our part, et cetera, et cetera. Are you going to tell us what due diligence mean? You know, so again, it's that paradigm shift because we do it to ourselves.
Right.
And it's just a challenge that we face as practitioners in the field.
Right. Those questions. How far do we have to go? How far down the line? Where are we going to get this information? Yes.
When I'm looking at these acts and policies, and the one thing I learned about MIPA was that it's halfway enforced, and that's the fear that I have about all these things, is that it looks great, this sounds good, looks great, looks wonderful, but if there's no accountability from the federal government to the state, no accountability from the state to the local agencies, adoption agencies, if there's no enforcement, I mean, how can you enforce the delaying or denying of adoption placement based on race, but you can't enforce states to diligently recruit? Doesn't make any sense. So I'm looking at this and I'm saying, this looks great, but if there's no enforcement, if there's no penalty for states to do this, then no one's going to take this seriously. You ask the question, why in the world has it taken however many decades that we've been talking about this to now, and we still haven't gotten there? It's because it looks great on paper, but there has been no penalty or incentive, or however you want to say it, to force states to comply. But again, with MIPA, they're forcing, there's litigation towards delaying and denying placement on the basis of race, but there's no enforcement on diligent recruitment. So I just wanted to make that comment that all this stuff is great, these laws and the policies, but the enforcement is missing.
Yeah, that's real. MIPA and IEP were passed in 1994-96. Yeah.
Just another thought. You know, when you put this in the context of the workload issues that are there and that are real, the last bullet around the 30 days, the first thing that popped into my head, I got excited, as Corey mentioned. And then I saw the 30 days and I thought, how quickly would it be for folks to say 30 days, I looked, couldn't find them, I'm done. And not go beyond 30 days to continue the search. I think I can easily see that being misinterpreted.
I'm sure you're right. Easily misinterpreted. 1 out of 30 days. Right. And my fear would be that we'll be talking about the same thing 10 years from now and still saying this was the law in 2008 and how, yeah.
I think that there's ways to be creative. I know when I worked for the county, and it was like 15 years ago, and while they had 2 clerks, and they would, while families had to wait for their court hearings, they had little family trees, and they would go and meet. The families were sitting around anyway. It was like time. And so it was actually, they liked having something to do, and they would have them fill out family trees. And, you know, they did away with that after a few years, but that was the most effective way. And, you know, anything that engages families right away and tries to get that kind of information up front is so helpful. But I think they don't have to cost a lot.
Right.
But there are ways to try to get that information if you can wrap your mind about.
And that's
we need this right up front.
Right. And that's going to be an important area for training, to talk about these different approaches. Like you're saying, you know, while you're sitting in the courtroom, have the family tree done. Do some training on how to make this happen. Be creative about it. Just don't leave it up to the, you know, to the worker to try to figure it out. The other thing that this law is doing is expands the availability of federal Title IV training dollars to cover training of staff not only in public agencies but in private agencies, as well as court personnel, attorneys, guardian ad litem, CASAs. That's new. And it also allows 4E training dollars to be used to train prospective relative guardians in addition to foster and adoptive parents. So again, you know, the proof is in the pudding. Let's hope that it actually happens, all this stuff is implemented, and that there are resources to implement each of these requirements of the legislation. Because we've got a lot of children that are awaiting adoption. As we talked about before, there are 129,000, and we look at those children. The majority of those children that are needing adoption are minority children. 32% are African American, 20% are Hispanic. We add up all the different groups. That's a lot of kids that are needing placement with disproportionate minority representation in that group. These are children that were removed at an average age of 4.9 years of age. They've been in care what I call almost 4 birthdays. That's been a long time these children have been in care. Average mean age, 8.2. Majority of the children in care are males, 53%. And then when you look at the data, and that will tell you a picture, but again, going back to your own individual data on this, look at the time in care, and I always get concerned about that 20% that have been in continuous foster care from 3 to 5 years. 25,000. And then this other group, 24,000, or 19% of those children awaiting adoption that have been in care, in foster care, for 60 or more months. And when you start drilling down on that and try to figure out, well, what happened to these kids? And how long have they been in care? And how many different places have they been? Is it sort of like was in a state recently, and we were talking about a child that had been in 63 different placements. Well, what does that mean to that child? And even if you've been in only 2, what does that mean to the child? Each time the child is changing communities and families and changing schools and changing friends. And we were talking about the concept recently of changing smells. Because when children go from place to place, you know how when you get home and you feel like, oh, I'm home. You sort of smells like home. Well, these children don't have a smell like home because they go from place to place to place. And what is their interpretation? There was an article that was entitled, I Was Tooken. And that article is suggesting that children so often that come into the system feel that way because they don't understand why they have been, as they say, tooken. And they've been removed. And how do I justify that? And trying to understand the significance of that. We know again from the GAO report that according to HHS adoption data over the last 5 years, African American children as well as Native American children have consistently experienced lower rates of adoption than other races and ethnicities. Due to misunderstandings of MEPA IEPA, some workers are less likely to recruit and less likely to place African American children with relatives and in African American adoptive homes. Both of those were findings of the GAO report related to adoptions with African American children. We know that black children represent an increasing smaller percentage of all children adopted from care. If you look at the percentages, again, back in 1997, about 44% adopted from care were black. By 2006, 27% of children adopted from care were black. Look at your trend data in your states to see whether or not there are changes over time. A number of factors that relate to the situation of African American disproportionality. Among those have to do with favoring placement over family preservation, termination of parental rights over reunification, providing greater financial support and services to non-kin versus kin caregivers, and then this concern about MIPA violations that I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes. I had the opportunity just a week ago or so, and some of you also were there, to be at the Diligent Recruitment Grantees Conference and got access, fortunately, to the new HHS slides that specifically talk about MIPA, which is the official word from HHS. And according to HHS, the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act has the purpose of, it was designed to decrease the length of time children wait to be adopted, to facilitate identification and recruitment of families that can meet the child's needs, and to prevent discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin. There's an interesting report many of you probably also have that was issued by the Evan B. Donaldson Adoption Institute back in May, which specifically does a really good job of analyzing all of the factors and similarities and differences between our federal law related to specifically MIPA and IEPA, comparing that to, as you mentioned before, Hague, and the differences there, which call for 10 hours of training for families who wish to adopt from other countries. Yet we don't have such a requirement with MIPA, IEPA. And it also points to the differences in how we have over time had law that looks differently at different groups. For example, the Indian Child Welfare Act has specific statements about where Indian children should be placed, and they must be placed initially within the family, within the tribe, if not within the tribe of, within another tribe, different reservation, and only if that can't be done off the reservation. But we have 3 different policies related to the placement of children: Hague, the Indian Child Welfare Act, and MIPA, IEPA. When we look at MIPA, it prohibits the use of a child's or prospective parent's what's called race, color, or national origin, RCNO, to delay or deny the child's placement. It requires states to provide for diligent recruitment of potential foster and adoptive families. But the question is, to what extent has that requirement actually been implemented? And we were just talking about that. The Civil Rights Commission held hearings on MIPA back in, I think it was in September. And many of these concerns were raised at that Civil Rights Commission hearing about the fact that one part of the law has been implemented by the Civil Rights Commission, U.S. Civil Rights Office, but not the diligent recruitment piece. The interethnic provisions, we know in 1996 MIPA was amended to affirm and strengthen the prohibition against discrimination by removing potentially misleading language regarding the consideration of race, color, and national origin. It strengthened the compliance and enforcement procedures by requiring assessment of a penalty against a state agency or entity that violated MIPA. As a result of the law, states and other entities must ensure that they do not deny anyone the opportunity to adopt or foster a child on the basis of race, color, or national origin. If you've looked at Joan Hollinger's report and their interpretation of MIPA, clearly there are guidelines for recruitment under MIPA. It can be done, and it can be done very successfully. It requires diligent recruitment that reflect the ethnic and racial diversity of the children who need homes. According to Hollinger's interpretation, there's targeted recruitment efforts should be part of a comprehensive strategy, not the only strategy, but part of a comprehensive strategy aimed at reaching all segments of the community. Information should be disseminated to targeted communities through organizations such as churches and neighborhood centers, but it just can't be the only way that you're disseminating information. Diligent recruitment from the HHS requirements specifically states that it must allow prospective parents to participate in general recruitment activities irrespective of their race, color, or national origin. You must accept applications from prospective parents who are not from one of the communities on which the agency is focusing their efforts. So you're focused on, say, African Americans, but you can't not accept applications from those who are not African Americans. You must include them in general recruitment activities. You must accept applications from prospective parents who express an interest in providing a care for a child that looks different than they are. You must be open to accepting those applications. The Child and Family Services reviews assess whether a state is making concerted efforts to maintain a child's important connections, which might include those ties to the community. ACF recognizes that in many cases it's a good idea to help a child preserve those ties especially when the child is expected to be reunified with his or her parents or family member in the same neighborhood. And clearly, according to the directive from HHS, making concerted efforts to maintain a child's important connections do not violate MIPA or Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Now, I know there's going to be a lot more training on the implications of MIPA so that more staff are aware, and I know the National Resource Center is going to be doing this to make it real clear what you can do. Because a lot of people have done this, taken the safe road and just not done it because they think we are in violation, fearful of being sued. There was an interesting article that was published, I think, either Child Welfare Adoption Quarterly just about a month ago, which used a random sample of 261 social workers in child welfare to see what they knew about MIPA and IEPA. And of that sample, they found that the respondents seemed knowledgeable about the laws, but remained uncertain about the intended purpose. They tended to lack knowledge about research on transracial adoptions. And of course, there's a huge body of literature on transracial adoptions. Most felt MIPA did not affect their practice, and most had not attended training on the requirements. Now, that's based upon this published study by MAP and Queen and Eric and Taylor, 2008. The majority of the respondents indicated race is a continuing factor in adoptive placements. How many of you have received training on MIPA, IEPA? Okay. Many people in the room have. And there are a lot of places in which the staff may have received it, but did still, how many of you really understand it? Let me put it like that. Fully understand it. Because a lot of times they may have received training, but it's, yeah. But what does it mean? What does it mean? We know that there's a lot of information out there in terms of whether ways in which you can recruit in keeping with the law. We know that there's a need for specialized recruitment, and this is an important thing, you can recruit all you want. But if you don't retain the families, we haven't succeeded. And so much of our focus has been on recruitment and not following through. The study we just did with the Collaboration to Adopt Us Kids was one in which we followed families over time, families who had applied to adopt, to see how many of them actually got through the process. And there are a lot of barriers out there that keep families from getting through the process. If we look at the need for these specialized initiatives, we know that currently there are lots of children, 49,000 white, 41,000 African American, 25,000 Hispanic, 2,000 and so American Indian children that are waiting to be adopted. We need more training and technical assistance, and through some of the work of Adopt Us Kids and the National Resource Center and the new diligent recruitment grants, hopefully that's going to happen so that we have more training on how to do it. How do you preserve connections for children with their families? How do we make this happen? Just very quickly, as an ad for Adopt Us Kids, you've already seen the ad campaign. Heidi has shown this before, but there are so many opportunities, more than ever before, that can be used to help recruit, like these ads. But I go around to state after state and I bring the ads and talk about it, and I have people look at me like I've never seen these before. It's amazing. When I start talking about the website, there's a lot of information that needs to be imparted. The campaign, the Adopt Us Kids campaign, the idea is to change the public perception about adopting children from the system, to increase the number of potential families, to ultimately get more of the older children placed from care. There are lots of effective recruitment strategies that have been launched, including the Heart Gallery. How many of you have Heart Gallery in your communities? Is it working? You getting kids placed? Those beautiful pictures of the children just makes a difference. The use of exchanges, the faith-based initiatives, the Spanish language campaign through Adopt Us Kids, the word-of-mouth initiatives, the ad campaign. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be a hero to be a hero. All these. This is free of charge. How many of you know you can get all these resources by just clicking on Adopt Us Kids? All these resources are available. The publications. How many of you have copies of the Adopt Us Kids publications? Amazing publications that can be useful. The barriers and success factors I mentioned before, the dollars and cents publication. The one I really like, Finding a Fit That Will Last a Lifetime. A Guide to Connecting Adoptive Families with Waiting Children. Excellent work. That again, for different reasons, not enough people are using the materials that have been developed. Finding Common Ground, A Guide to Connecting Adoptive Families with Communities of Faith. Lasting Impressions, A Guide for Photo Listing Children. The Practitioner's Guide, Getting More Parents for Children with Your Recruitment Efforts. The Military Families Guide. All of these free. Yes?
I was just going to make a comment. To make a comment that all of those publications, if you go to www.adoptuskids.org, they're downloadable for free.
Right.
So if you haven't seen them or if you don't have a hard copy of them, you can download the publications. They're free. Or you can contact Adopt Us Kids and they'll send you a copy as well.
You
Just
can
wanted
get
to say
a
that.
fancy printed copy or just download it. But the materials there are really, really important, and they're very, very useful. The Adopt Us Kids, of course, has a national recruitment campaign. There's a respite program there with many grant awards for parent support groups. Lots of resources are out there more than ever before. And the idea is to pass that information around. We need to focus in on addressing the issue of disproportionality in terms of being able to be successful in recruiting under MIPA guidelines. We need to have more training and support of child welfare staff in working in diverse communities, how you go about doing it, how to recruit in those communities, educate staff on the realities of MIPA-IEPA. I know that's going to happen. Heidi?
I just wanted to mention, because you referred to it, but I'm just not sure that everyone's aware that there was a funding announcement for the diligent recruitment grants, and there were 9 awarded, and it's $400,000 a year for 5 years, and Adopt Us Kids is going to work closely with it, and we just had the kickoff meeting. So we're hoping that they will come up with some great strategies that are demonstration projects and will help improve the knowledge in the field. So I just wanted to mention that again.
And these are the grantees. These are the ones that just received funding that Heidi's talking about. Oklahoma Department of Human Services, Cuyahoga County in Ohio, County of Santa Cruz, Maryland Department of Human Services, City and County of Denver, New York State Office of Children and Family Services, Missouri Department of Social Services, Department of Community-Based Services, Frankfort, Kentucky, and Ramsey County in Minnesota. Those are the grantees that Heidi's talking about that just received those $400,000 diligent recruitment grants. And the focus will be on finding strategies and working closely with Adopt Us Kids to promote adoptions. There's a lot of interest in it, as you said, over 40 applications, and these were the ones that were funded. These grantees are going to have to look at what's out there. What do we know? Especially we start talking about diligent recruitment, how we target those grants to be successful, how we can figure out after, and they all have evaluations, after the next 2 or 3 years, is there a difference? Are we seeing differences in who's getting adopted? Are we seeing differences in the overall number of adoptions? We know that with some of Penny Mazza's work, that there are racial differences in the characteristics of African American adoptive parents. She's reported that African American adoptive parents are more likely to be single black women 50 or older. African American children more likely to be adopted by foster parents or relatives than through what some people call stranger adoptions. We're changing that, right, Heidi? The other concept, and Rob Geen has found as well, that relatives are more likely to adopt African American male children. One of the first things you do in terms of using your data is to see who's adopting African American children in your city, county, region, state. Who's adopting them? Are they relatives? Are they foster parents? Are they single adopters? What's their age range? Because that tells you one thing about targeting recruitment, but it also tells you, well, okay, if we're getting mostly single women in there, what are we missing here? Why aren't we getting single men? We got a lot of adolescent males that need somebody, that would love to have a male in their life. What are we doing to recruit those? We need to have more training on recruiting and retaining. How do we use the data? Who's adopting? How long are they waiting? What are we learning from those programs that have been successful? How have we involved the community? Or have we involved the community? How do we overcome barriers to retaining families? How do we respond to a family when they call? How do we recruit using MIPA guidelines? How do we train staff to do special approaches to recruit for older children? We're now talking about trying to keep sibling groups together. How do we make that happen? How do we get buy-in from staff that this is important? How do we give training on how you write an entry to be added to the exchange? And in order to do this, the first step is to see, well, what are you currently doing? What kind of recruitment is going on in your community? Is it word of mouth? Are you using families that have already adopted? Do you have brochures? Is it more general recruitment or is it more specific recruitment? What kind of who's answering the phone when somebody calls? Do you have a toll-free telephone line? And who answers that phone? And how have they been trained? And what if somebody's all excited about adopting, they just saw an ad and you've got somebody say, well, there's nobody here who can talk to you today. Maybe next week. They're on a retreat. They're all on a retreat. Well, I thought you had 129,000 children that need placement. Are we training those people that answer the phone? Who's answering the phone? And do they understand? And are we tracking? We had a project in Texas sponsored through Casey a few years ago in which we tracked from the time of an ad all the way through to the end what happened to families. And in this case, they were being referred to other agencies. Well, that's not good enough either. I want to know if they got referred, did they ever get through? Did they ever get a child? We need to, there was a recent story in the New York Times that talked about some search parties that were designed. They had some foster wear parties, you know, not Tupperware, but foster wear parties to get foster parents to recruit others. They've even tried something like speed dating. We talk about speed dating, meet and greet, in fact, involving children in this process, speed dating. Selecting families from the website, using the website. We got, as I said, more than 4,000 children on the Adopt Us Kids website. Who's using it? I was in a state the other day that had less than 1,000 children waiting, and I said, well, there are 4,000 families on the website. Somebody ought to be available. There are families there. Some places are offering funds to, you know, having a finder's fee. You find some more families, here's $500. It works. And then when you have a recruitment campaign, the next step is to follow, to see, well, how many people went to this event? Who was there? Did you get the people you wanted to come to that event? I often tell the story about an event that we had in my home state in which we were having Victoria Rowell come to, you know, Victoria. And I knew her from Young and the Restless days. And she was coming to the event, and we were real proud of this and had this huge thing happening. But the plan was, the plan was to bring a bus and take all the participants off to the Wildflower Center so they could be there and meet her and everything. And they came to a community school to pick up the families. They were looking for preferably minority families, came to pick them up, and then when they got over there and looked on the bus, there were just a handful of people there. But yet there were a whole lot of families that would have just stayed at the school. Why do you need to take them clear across town and ride for 45 minutes to see her? Just all you had to do was say, Victoria Rowell is here from Young and the Restless. And people would come out. You don't have to take them across town and look at some flowers in the process. But we have to plan events that are really effective, that will make a difference for children. And then you plan your event. Well, how many come to orientation? And then from that, following these families, how many apply to adopt? How many get a home study completed? How many get approved? How many get a placement? What happened in the placement in the end? Did the placement disrupt? Did they finalize? And you're tracking this for all your events to see, well, what's working and what's not. This event didn't work. We held it here, that we didn't get many people. We're not going to do that again. Let's try something else. But we tend to do the same thing over and over. We did it last year. We'll do the same thing. When we look at recruitment and retention, much of the literature that looks at this issue suggests that it does help. It does help to have African American staff. and have members of the community that are on the board and involve African American adoptive families in recruitment efforts. It's been found that does help in terms of, and it's important to have staff assess their own stereotypes, to assess what their attitudes are towards families. A lot of times as we're looking at kin to adopt, we have staff who sometimes think, well, you know, I don't know about that because the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and I don't know if that grandmother should adopt the child. She didn't do a very good job raising her daughter who the child has been removed from. We need to talk about that and figure out how best to assess these families. Agencies have to have a relationship in the community, and not just to come out to a church once a year, to a black church, to try to figure out what kind of ongoing relationship. Years ago, when I used to place children for adoption, we set up a program in a church. It was in Wichita, Kansas. We set up a program. We started an agency called Black Adoption Program and Services, and when we started that agency, we started off in a church. There were families in that church. They didn't have to go anyplace. They were there. We know that personal contact and showing respect makes a difference in terms of recruitment. Staff have to be available. They have to be responsive. This key word in all of our work is called customer service. We have to learn from businesses to be able to give service, because if you want people to come into your store, like you hear all the stores now trying to get people to come in to buy during Christmas season. Well, you have to use that mentality. How do we get people to come in the door? First of all, who do we want to attract? And how do we connect with those people we want to attract? How do we get them to come in the door? And then when they come in, how do we keep them involved? Because we have so many families who just fall through the cracks because nobody called them back. Even after the home study was approved, nobody called me back. So I assume they didn't want me. I know, as one family in our study said, I know my home study is sitting on somebody's desk, but I don't know where it is, who's looking at it, or if they even have time to think about it. Agencies need to develop a community education program to acquaint families with the need for adoptive homes and to assess the community in terms of how does the community deliver that recruitment message. We need relationships with pastors of churches. Relationships, not an event that you go to once a year, but relationships. Singleton and Roseman did a study of 51 black ministers in Florida, and they found that 83% of the ministers had never included the topic of foster care or adoption in their sermons. And most had no experience with adoption or foster care. Agencies have to find out how to connect with these ministers and talk with them about it. I've talked with a group of ministers not too long ago, and I said, how many of you actually talk about this issue? I had very few who raised their hands, who know about the issue. There was another, in fact, published in this issue of Child Welfare, Kathleen Bellinger and her co-authors talked about their study of 53 African-American adoptive families who adopted 98 African-American, 10 biracial children, and they found, first of all, in their study, that these families were attending church regularly. They found that faith in God was the single greatest reason for adopting. These families were saying nothing is as important as serving God. They found that, and they recommended that we have what's called religious cultural competence. Religious cultural competence in recruitment. To specifically know how you reach out to a church. They've suggested empower families to act on their desire to accomplish God's will by providing information, training, and ultimately the adopted child, but only if it's God's will for them. And that's what they learned from this study. It's not just we go to the church. It's dealing with churches in a different way. And many of you know, and you probably saw just last week about the story on Bennett Chapel that was on Charlie Gibson's show as while we were in Washington last week. Everybody know about Bennett Chapel? This is a book on it if you haven't read about Bennett Chapel. How Love Came to the Least of These. Small town, big miracle. Bennett Chapel is a community in deep East Texas, in a community called Possum Trot. In Possum Trot, the roads are not paved. In Possum Trot, they have a church that's called Bennett Chapel Missionary Baptist Church. And those families in the church And it started with the minister, Pastor Martin. He told me the other day he's Bishop Martin. Bishop Martin and his wife Donna. They've been featured on Oprah. They've been on the home makeover, that, all those different shows. Okay, this is a story about a pastor and his wife. His wife had lost her mother. She was trying to get over her death, and all of a sudden she decided, I got to do something. It's God's will that I do something for somebody else. And she began to think about it and said, I've been fortunate that I had a mother. And even though she's gone, I had a mother. Well, what can I do about the children who don't have a mother? And that's what launched this initiative. She went to her husband, she went to her sister, she went to a number of other people, and in all, these families from Bennett Chapel have adopted 70 children from the Houston area. They've adopted sibling groups. They've adopted lots of kids with lots of issues. And because they have been featured so, the Home Makeover show, they heard that they needed a community or family center, and they built it for them. And it was on a couple of years ago. Amazing. When you go to that church, if you ever have a chance and you see the children, and that's what you see when you go to the church, because it's just I'm not talking about a congregation of 10,000. I'm talking about a couple hundred families in this church. But they brought in 70 children. And these are families, and the reason for adopting was religious-based. If you interview any of these families, they say they had a call from God to adopt. And that's a piece that we haven't connected with before. And these families have had some amazing stories because they've had amazing challenges. These are families who, by the way, aren't rich. These are families who are pretty low income. These are families who ordinarily might not have been approved to adopt because their houses might not have been just right. But you know what? They used their subsidy to do what? They bought some double-wide trailers. And those trailers have been formed. There's some that are like cul-de-sacs, and you go from one to another. They do respite care for each other. These are families that are in this small community called Possum Trot that have been successful. And if we talk about programs which have been extremely successful, like One Church, One Child, and others, we're talking about a church that didn't just do one child. They adopted a whole community of children who are there for one another. And the families are there for one another. And many of these families, just one more thing, many of these families had already parented their own children. But guess what? In Possum Trot, there's not a whole lot to do once your kids are grown. Because all you do, parented these kids have already retired. So they brought in some more children. And they've been good at it. Yes.
I know, Ruth, we do a very large church outreach. We have a ministry outreach initiative in Pittsburgh, and we did bring Bishop Martin in to Pittsburgh a few years ago so that he could talk to the pastors that we deal with in our outreach. And one of the things when you were talking about having the ability to speak to them on a different level, that is so true, because pastors don't have time generally to pick up another issue, because one of the things that has happened is people come in from the community all the time about what we can do for you, what we can do for your community, and then they never hear back from them again. And so the pastors don't want people to keep coming in and out and introducing themselves to their congregation. But we just had one last Saturday, ministry outreach luncheons, where we invite the ministers that we've been working with and then invite them to invite new ones to come so that we can have them to talk specifically about adoption across their pulpit. And we talk about the least of these all the time and put that in their ear. The religious speaking, that's what they understand, that we've all been adopted into the body of Christ. And so we have to be able to adopt children as well. But I did a religious TV show last week also for National Adoption Month. And one of the things that the host ended up saying was that he wants the listeners to begin, instead of saying, I have to say no until God says yes, he turned that around and said, I need you to say yes until God says no. So I had him to begin to speak the language over the airwaves then of what I needed them to be able to hear and to say and to do. But the church thing works, but you have to really know the language to go in there with to discuss with them.
That's great. That's great. Great example. Yeah.
We contract with somebody to do our church recruitment. She does 5 or 6 churches a month that she's in. We've gotten good reception from them, but one of the things that came to my mind when you talked about Bishop Martin was to purchase the book for all of our ministers.
Have them read it. It's
Yeah,
great.
bringing in, it might be out of our budgetary thing, but I think I can pull the books.
Yeah, it's great, and it tells the story and has pictures of the families and all beautifully done. And so, I was talking with him just last week, and he said we got a lot of work to do because we got a lot more children that need to be placed. I'll pass it around. Small town, big miracle. As we think about the recruitment process and preparing families, it's important to, once these families, and one thing that's unique about the community of Bennett Chapel, they support one another. And once families have adopted, they need to be able to be together and provide support, get respite services and so forth. All of these are really, really important. There have been a lot of other studies looking at recruitment and retention. I know you're familiar with the work that was done by Casey in 2005, in which they worked with 22 public child welfare agencies, and they found that a lot of times agencies have a history of negative interactions within the community, but they also found that as they developed relationships with the faith-based organizations in African American communities, they achieved increases in the number of families. It's all about relationships. It made a big difference. We did a study published in 2005 of 83 African American families who adopted children from agencies in California, and we found that about 84% of families reported the availability of an African American adoption agency was either very important or important to them in their decision to pursue adoption, just having access to that agency. Robert Hill has also found that a lot of times if there are African American controlled organizations, they've been successful recruiting and placing children. You can do it, and you can work with them under MEPA guidelines, although a state may contract with a private agency to make public announcements, say, for example, in Spanish to recruit Hispanic foster and adoptive parents. The only thing about MEPA, it's just you can't rely exclusively on that private agency. For example, you can't just contract with the Institute for Latino Parenting. You can't just contract with the Institute for African American Parents. You have to do overall recruitment. You just can't exclusively do this. This is the key, according to the guidelines. In identifying a potential pool of foster and adoptive parents, the state must consider individuals listed with agencies that recruit parents from all ethnic groups. There are specializing agencies. They're listed. You can find the entire list on the NACAC website. Just to name a few that often have families waiting for children. There are over 20 African American specializing adoption agencies. Again, it's a matter of recruitment, as this says, but I think recruitment is particularly labor intensive in that it takes a lot of effort to get one response from a family who will follow through. But that's what it takes. A lot of work has been done on how to improve the recruitment process. The Urban Institute had a report on it. There are reports after reports. All the information is out there. We just need to utilize the information to make it possible to address the need, to figure out what kind of groups do we want. Target the recruitment. We want women of this age, men of this age, families of this age. What groups do they belong to? How do we reach out to them? It's often best if you know somebody from that particular group. How do we connect with them? How do we improve customer service? As the name of one organization is, you've got to believe, and that's the idea. You've got to believe that there are families out there. How do you convince workers that you can find a family for that 17-and-a-half-year-old? There is a family out there for them, that sibling groups can be adopted together. We need to do more involvement of youth and hearing from them, because often we find out from a youth, well, wait a minute, it's amazing, I'm still in contact with Aunt so-and-so and she lives in Michigan. And we didn't even know that. We haven't even asked the question. We need to identify people who've had contact with the youth and reestablish those connections. Because a lot of times we find that the youth may be the best resource, because again, the reality is when they age out, where are they going? Back home. Back home. We need to continue to do child-specific recruitment for adolescents, and finding out, well, who are all the people they've been connected to? It could have been a previous foster parent. It could have been a teacher. It could have been a mentor. It could have been a coach. All these different resources. Just sort of do a map. I like to do maps of all the potential placements for a child. There are checklists that have been developed as well in terms of what have you done for each child on your list? Has there been a diligent search completed? Where's the child registered? Look at each of the children in your state. How many exchanges are they on? Or are they on one at all? Because they only get exposure if they're out there. Are they on the local, state, regional? Are they on Adopt Us Kids? Are they on adoption.com? Has the child been prepared for adoption, and in what way? Has the child been featured on a waiting child program? Is the child in the Heart Gallery? Has the child been featured at some matching event or in a newsletter? But most importantly, what has been the outcome of each? We've been featuring this child for the last 2 years. Nothing happened. Well, what does that say? Don't do that anymore. Do something different. We're featuring them in the wrong venue. We have to change what we're doing. And these are some of the kids that I always bring around because I'm always looking for families. But when we start looking at some of the children that are available, and when you see them, and as I take them around and I see them get older, continue to get older each year, and you begin to wonder what could have been done on the front end, what could have been done to keep them, number one, from even coming into the system, and what could have been done to establish permanency at an earlier point. A lot of times we have to think about it in terms of how we talk about the kids. We need to use positive language. We need to talk about possibilities and potential and have that unrelenting belief they can be placed. And the reality is, if we don't have hope that they can be placed, how do we expect the children to have any hope? Have we given up? And that's another thing that was mentioned earlier. These are all our kids. I don't care whether that child is from Rhode Island or from Texas or from California, Michigan, or Utah. They are all our children. And so all the children, sometimes we're very, wondering, oh, we got to keep this family here because some child in our state might need this family. But there's a child in another state that doesn't have a family, because while we're holding on to ours, the idea that they're all our kids and all of our families. We need to continue to ask ourselves, what can each of us do differently? And I usually ask the question, who's a recruiter? How many of you are recruiters in this room? I'm going to ask it again. How many of you are recruiters in this room? There's not a one of us that is not a recruiter. I fly all over the country all the time, and I'm constantly talking to the person, I don't care whether they want to talk to me or not, next to me about families. We need some families. And they may not adopt, but they may know somebody, and they're going to remember that crazy person talked to them about adoption, and they may mention it. We are all recruiters. It may not be in our job description, but if you ever leave your home and you talk to somebody down the street, go to work, go to the beauty shop, go to the grocery store, we're all recruiters because we're always talking to somebody. That's our job. We need to think about what we can each do differently in terms of recruiting and retaining families for children of color using MIPA guidelines. Think about how you'll go about making it happen, what challenges lie ahead, how are they going to be overcome. And what we've talked about today is a challenge. And I like to think about it in terms of vision, because vision is seeing the opportunity in the challenge. We have an opportunity, and we probably have an opportunity more than we've ever had before to do something about this. We have to be, as Mahatma Gandhi always says, we must be the change we want to see in the world. And we are here to be able to do that. The kids are out there, and as Terry Tempest Williams says, the eyes of the future are looking back at us, and they're praying that we will see beyond our own time. That's our work. That's our goal. No matter what we're doing in this business, it's up to us to try to find some permanence for those families and for those children. I'd love to say in 2 years from now we're going to come back and all of a sudden Heidi's going to report to us that 70,000 children were placed. And then the next year we're going to hear 90,000 were children. And I want you to say one day we don't have any. And so that's our goal. We can work ourselves out of a job. Thank you.